A German prisoner of war starving for years in a world of scrap and ration cards expected American captivity to be a steel cage of cruelty. Instead, he found a land of such terrifying abundance that he would watch his captors casually throw away perfect, untouched food, a profound act of waste that finally shattered his will. The train had been moving for 3 days across a landscape so wide and empty it felt like the edge of the world. Inside the cramped boxcar, the air was thick with sweat, fear, and the pervasive, gnawing reality of hunger. Among the 60 German prisoners sat Klaus Richter, a former agricultural apprentice captured in North Africa. He was just 20 years old, yet his face was already etched with the lines of wartime scarcity. He wasn't thinking of the surrender, the capture, or the long sea voyage. He was thinking of the bread. Back home near Hamburg, flour had become a ghost. A single loaf, dense and dark, was shared among a family for an entire week, supplemented only by thin, metallic potato water soup. The most common shame in wartime Germany wasn't cowardice, but the constant, embarrassing ache in the stomach. The Reich had taught them that the Americans, being materialistic, would surely starve their prisoners into submission. The train finally jolted to a stop in the harsh, dry heat outside Camp Swift, Texas. As Klaus blinked against the dust-caked afternoon sun, he saw not the steel cages he'd been promised, but low, neat wooden barracks. He braced for the rifle butts, but instead came the quiet, lazy efficiency of the Geneva Conventions, demanding humane treatment. This quiet discipline was utterly bewildering. The final destination was the mess hall, a structure so large it felt like a factory floor. A smell hit them that made every man freeze. Coffee. Real, dark, aromatic coffee, strong enough to make a person feel energized. Then came the food. Each man received a tray heavy with beef stew, white bread with butter, and apple pie. It was a caloric miracle, over 3,200 calories, more than most German civilians were allocated in a day. Klaus stared at the plate, unable to eat half. He put his fork down, his mind racing. Then the kitchen steward, Sergeant Dale, walked past, casually holding a small, unblemished red apple. Dale took one single large bite and tossed the rest of the perfectly good apple directly into a refuse bin. Klaus stared at the half-eaten fruit. This wasn't starvation. It was a casual, offensive display of power he could not reconcile. Klaus had just stepped across the threshold from scarcity to surplus, and that surplus would soon become his greatest fear. The military assignment sheet confirmed Klaus's new duty, quartermaster's detail. He and 3 others were marched across the vast, dusty camp toward the supply depot, the true measure of their captors. Klaus expected the depot to be a fortress of iron-willed German efficiency. But the American warehouse was something else entirely. It was an echoing cavern built of corrugated iron filled to the ceiling with unbelievable plenty. Imagine a treasure room, built not for gold, but for food. Sacks of gleaming white flour stood like pillars. Boxes of tinned fruit were stacked impossibly high, side upon side of beef hung on massive hooks. This was not a fortress. It was an Aladdin's cave designed by logistics, and its biggest secret was its breathtaking scale. The American in charge was Sergeant Dale, who treated the staggering inventory with casual indifference. He simply told them to stack the crates, move the goods, and try not to make a mess. He emphasized no great fear of theft or wastage. This lack of anxiety over scarcity was the first great shock to Klaus's worldview. Back home, a single misplaced tin could be a court-martial offense. Klaus worked with a frantic internal reverence. Yet, the longer he worked, the more chilling details emerged. He saw a 200-pound sack of flour with a minor tear. In Germany, this would be stitched. Here, an American private simply used packing tape to cover the tear. Then, near the back, Klaus found a crate of canned corn that had been tipped over. 2 tins had rolled under a rack, and Sergeant Dale, rather than crawl to retrieve them, simply logged the crate as 2 units short. The time saved was deemed more valuable than the food. Klaus looked at the lost tins, each one holding enough food to feed a family for a day in Hamburg. He wanted to cry out against the careless neglect of something so sacred as unspent calories. Yet, the Americans did not see neglect. They saw efficiency. They had so much that the time spent on frugality was considered the true waste. Klaus felt a cold certainty about the war's outcome settle deep in his gut. The realization that they could afford such careless bounty terrified him more than any propaganda had. The mess hall was a daily theater of cultural collision. Klaus Richter's work detail placed him at the core of the cleanup crew, bussing tables where American soldiers would casually abandon high-calorie remnants into enormous rolling swill barrels. To Klaus, this was a profanity. The head kitchen steward, Sergeant Dale, treated the discarded food with the same indifference. He wasn't cruel. He was simply a product of a different, wealthier world. The goal of the mess hall was not to be frugal, but to feed the men efficiently. Frugality was a logistical inconvenience. One afternoon, the sight became too much. American aviation cadets had rushed through their lunch, leaving behind a tray stacked with 5 identical, untouched loaves of white bread. For Klaus, this was the ultimate symbol of the enemy's power. He thought instantly of the desperation in Germany, where a loaf of bread could be traded for medicine. He glanced at Sergeant Dale, then quickly reached out, intending to retrieve just one loaf to share with the hungriest prisoners. It was not stealing, it was rescue. His fingers had just closed around the warm, soft bread when a shadow fell over him. It was a quiet American private named Ed. Klaus froze, the fresh bread heavy in his hands. He prepared for the reprimand. But the private only looked at the bread, then at Klaus's desperate eyes, and slowly pointed not at the door, but at the enormous swill barrel overflowing with discarded food. The message was chilling. The American system preferred to throw the bread away than allow a prisoner to possess it on the sly. The quiet refusal to let him take the bread, not out of malice but out of cold adherence to a simple rule, delivered a far greater psychological blow than any punishment. Klaus let the loaf fall back onto the tray. His hunger felt like a physical ache of shame, and he now understood that the true enemy wasn't the soldier, but the crushing, indifferent abundance they represented. If you've ever wondered about the quiet human moments that define the biggest conflicts in history, you've found the right channel. Subscribe now and join our community as we continue to uncover the forgotten stories of people who found kindness in the most unlikely places. The unspoken rule of the kitchen was that the refuse bin was a graveyard, not a pantry. Yet, for Klaus Richter, that bin represented a constant, agonizing temptation. The next morning, Klaus was assigned to potato preparation, a task that required him to peel, wash, and chop dozens of sacks of potatoes. The raw vegetable carried the weight of wartime hardship. Here, the American guidelines were unforgiving. If a potato was bruised or misshapen, regulations dictated it be discarded entirely. The galvanized metal can beside Klaus was rapidly filling with perfectly salvageable potato flesh. It was enough food to feed his entire former farm commune back home for a week. He worked for hours, his hands moving, but his conscience screaming. Finally, he saw his chance. Quickly, he reached into the scrap can and pulled out a handful of the largest, least damaged potato chunks. He intended to tuck them into his tunic. He moved like a thief, heart pounding not from the fear of punishment, but from the deep-seated cultural fear of waste. Before the pieces were safely tucked away, a shadow blocked the harsh overhead lights. It was Sergeant Dale, standing silent. Dale had watched the movement. Klaus froze, dropping the potatoes. He braced for the inevitable roar, but Sergeant Dale didn't shout. He simply lowered his coffee mug and looked at the fallen potatoes, then at Klaus, a look of simple confusion. "What on the Sam Hill are you doing, son?" he asked. Klaus struggled for the right English words. "Sir, in Germany, food. Very small. This is good food. It's a waste, sir. It is a crime." Sergeant Dale stepped closer. He picked up one of the largest chunks and tossed it back into the can. "Look, I know where you come from, but listen to me," he said. "It's Army regulations. It's contaminated. Once it's in the scrap can, it's got to go to the swill detail. We can't serve it. We'd rather waste this food than waste the time treating one unwell soldier. That's the only law that matters here." Klaus stared, utterly defeated. The sergeant wasn't cruel. He was adhering to a logistical standard Klaus could barely fathom. The Americans had so much food they could afford to throw away enough to feed a small village simply to preserve operational speed. The abundance wasn't a luxury. It was a fundamental principle of American organization. Klaus slowly picked up his peeler, his hands shaking, and watched Sergeant Dale walk away. He knew then that the war was a battle against the overwhelming, cold logic of American efficiency, a logic that valued speed and security over simple thrift. This systemic shock was just the beginning of his new education. The cold truth about the abandoned loaf of bread and the discarded potatoes was not that the Americans were cruel, but that they had transcended the very notion of scarcity. Their system was designed for uninterrupted flow. Sergeant Dale, sensing the deep distress he had caused Klaus, decided to provide a strange sort of lesson. He took Klaus back to the quartermaster's office, dominated by huge, detailed charts. Dale unrolled one of the forms, pointing a greasy finger at columns of dizzying numbers. He explained that the camps received supplies via a nationwide network of trains and trucks, pulling resources from a domestic economy operating at a level the world had never witnessed. "See these columns?" Dale asked. "We deliberately order 20% more than we need." He paused, looking at Klaus. "Why? Because the cost of that extra 20% is less than the cost of one day where we run out." The historical truth was this: America was producing a surplus so vast it strained the limits of logistics. U.S. farmers were encouraged, even subsidized, to overproduce to ensure no front nor a single POW camp ever experienced a real shortage. Dale showed Klaus a photograph of the massive regional depot. "We factor in transport losses, spoilage, and the health code. It's all accounted for." Klaus looked at the figures, the weight of millions of pounds of food. In Germany, efficiency meant frugality. In America, efficiency meant abundance, producing so much so quickly that losing a few crates was immaterial. The American machine did not operate on need, it operated on surplus. Later, Klaus watched the camp's cleaning process. Huge industrial dishwashing units, conveyor belts, everything mechanized and rapid. The waste that had first horrified Klaus was now revealed as the chilling arrogance of a nation so powerful it didn't need to count every spoonful. This was the core difference in power. One side measured strength by rigid control, the other measured it by a confident, almost casual, unlimited capacity. Klaus realized his enemy was not a monster, but a machine of infinite plenty, and its existence undermined everything he had been taught. The truth about the American supply system was not merely that it allowed waste, but that it actively demanded the destruction of perfectly good resources to maintain its standards. This principle was about to be demonstrated to Klaus Richter with brutal, sugary clarity. A large, specialized shipment arrived at the quartermaster's warehouse, an entire train car filled with tinned fruit, mostly peaches. This was a delicacy that had vanished from the German table years ago. Klaus and his fellow POWs were tasked with unloading the heavy wooden crates. The smell of preserved sweetness, a heartbreaking reminder of things lost, filled the air. As they worked, an American supply officer began the inspection. Soon, he singled out 5 crates. "Stop," he ordered. Klaus stepped closer and saw the officer meant several dozen cans had minor dents from the rough ride. The food inside was entirely safe. In Germany, a dent can mean nothing. It was still food, still survival. Klaus watched, his stomach tightening, as the officer consulted his paperwork. He delivered the chilling verdict. "Botulism risk, supplier warranty voided. The entire shipment of damaged goods, 5 crates, goes to the disposal site." The order was given with the casual finality of a man signing a routine memo. The officer was firm. The health of the soldiers and the integrity of the supply line were non-negotiable. Klaus, alongside an older POW named Ernst, watched in mounting horror. Ernst began muttering in German. 5 crates! That is enough peaches to keep our hospital wards fed for 6 months. He tried to appeal to the officer, but the officer simply shook his head. "Order is order, fellas. This food is no longer fit for consumption under Army standards." The order was carried out. Klaus and Ernst were forced to restack the dented crates onto a separate flatbed destined for the incinerator. As they handled the cool, heavy tins, the visual contrast of the bright labels and the metal's cold surface burned into Klaus's mind. It was the active, regulated destruction of high-quality, perfectly edible sustenance. This was the climax of the systemic shock. The sight of the American machine, in conscious rejection of plenty, overwhelmed Klaus with profound personal loss. His nation sacrificed everything for a war it was certain to win, yet it was being defeated by a foe who could afford to throw away hundreds of pounds of fruit without a second thought. The sheer, terrifying power of this abundance was more destructive than any tank division. If this startling moment of cultural collision and waste sparks a memory or raises a question about your own history, let us know. Comment below and share your thoughts on the shocking differences in wartime life, and we'll respond to your observations. The destination for the dented cans of peaches was a remote, dusty pit. Here, the psychological war between scarcity and abundance would finally reach its shattering climax. Klaus and Ernst, along with two other reluctant POWs, rode on the back of a flatbed truck guarding their doomed cargo. The American regulation was simple. The food had to be physically destroyed before burial. Sergeant Dale, tasked with supervising the demolition, waited near the pit. Klaus grabbed a shovel. The task felt like a violation of every principle he had ever been taught. They pried open the wooden crates, revealing the stacks of tins, the air filled with the faint, sweet smell of American excess. Ernst started the process with a grunt, smashing the first few cans. Klaus began his own work with slow, agonizing movements. He picked up a can of sliced peaches, feeling its cool weight, and visualized his younger sister, Helga, back in Hamburg. He imagined her eyes lighting up at the sight of this one tin. He lowered the can, unable to bring the metal of the shovel down upon the innocent, colorful tin. The war had taken millions of lives, but to Klaus, this final act of calculated destruction felt like the most profound tragedy. He tried to reconcile his hungry homeland with the vision before him, hundreds of pounds of food deliberately rendered inedible by a wealthy enemy. Suddenly, the control he had maintained for weeks shattered. He dropped the shovel, the metal clanging loud in the stillness. He stumbled back, looking at the heap of shiny tins, and the tears came, hot and immediate. He turned his back to the sun, facing the direction of the distant German coast, and simply collapsed into quiet, body-shaking sobs. It wasn't just the peaches. It was the entire crushing weight of American superiority. He grieved, not just for the food, but for the moral and industrial victory it represented. His tears were for the futility of his nation's fight against a power so vast that it could afford to be both kind to its prisoners and utterly wasteful. Sergeant Dale turned when he heard the clatter. He walked over slowly, finding Klaus crumpled in the dust, weeping uncontrollably. Dale didn't understand the language of scarcity, but he understood grief. He simply stood there, watching the young German soldier grieve for the perfect food they were forced to destroy. The true difference between them was revealed. One man wept for the life that could have been saved, while the other only saw successful compliance with army regulations. The sound of a German man weeping over 5 crates of dented peaches was perhaps the most honest sound heard in that Texas camp all year. It was the sound of one world view, clashing irrevocably with another. Sergeant Dale stood over Klaus, his large shadow falling across the pitiful mound of canned fruit. He didn't offer a patrol wagon. He offered a clean handkerchief and a quiet conversation, sitting down heavily on an overturned crate. "I don't get it, son," Dale said. "It's just food. There's plenty more coming in tomorrow. Why the tears?" Klaus, wiping his eyes, tried to explain. He spoke in broken English about the bread rations, the Eintopf, and the knowledge that every bit of sugar was a matter of life or serious difficulty back home. He gestured at the cans. "Sir, this is wealth. You throw away life." Dale listened patiently. His answer was profoundly pragmatic. "Klaus, listen. We throw away the dented cans not because we're rich, but because we can afford the time to be safe." He explained that if one soldier got sick, the entire camp could shut down, disrupting the war effort. "We waste a little food so we can make more, faster, and keep the whole machine running smoothly. We'd rather waste 300 cans than lose one day of work." The American abundance was a quiet, devastating form of psychological warfare. The Reich had promised America was weak. Dale's explanation revealed that the materialism was so potent it created systems immune to scarcity. The kindness wasn't soft, It was the hardest, most efficient weapon of all. It proved their democratic system was superior. The system they were in was the opposite of the chaos they were promised. To Klaus, this was the ultimate cold realization of his nation's failure. The waste was a feature of success. It showed a nation whose priority was speed and safety over frugality. Sergeant Dale finally stood up. "Look, I know what you're feeling, but for us, this isn't personal. You're prisoners of war, and that means you're part of the system now. And the system says you get fed, you get treated right, and anything that might make you unwell gets buried." He picked up Klaus's abandoned shovel. "Your war's over, son. Now, let's finish the job." Klaus picked up the shovel. He had come to America expecting to hate his jailers, but instead he felt only a terrifying awe for the system that fed him while destroying the food he cherished. The emotional truth was that he had not been beaten by cruelty, but by unlimited supply. If you've been struck by the incredible difference between the two systems, imagine sharing this revelation with someone who still believes the propaganda. Share this story and invite your friends to witness the surprising human dynamics that decided the outcome of the war. April, 1945. The wind across Camp Swift carried the faint, undeniable scent of change. The endless engine of destruction was finally stuttering to a stop. The news arrived in fragmented whispers: the Russian advance, the fall of Berlin, the final surrender. For the German POWs, there was no celebration, only stunned silence. Their prison doors were opening, but what lay beyond was a broken homeland. Klaus Richter began processing for repatriation. He was no longer looking at the waste with horror, but with awe and potential. The sheer logistics of moving hundreds of thousands of prisoners was, to his newly educated eyes, another testament to the enemy's staggering capability. In the final week, Klaus was detailed back to the quartermaster's warehouse. The atmosphere was subdued. Dale was quiet, filling out endless forms. He caught Klaus staring, not at the shelves of food, but at the empty space where the massive requisition charts had hung. "What you looking at, son?" Dale asked. Klaus shrugged. "The machine," he replied simply. "The system. It never stops." He confessed that he no longer feared the abundance. He had begun to understand its power. He saw how the 20% buffer and the relentless speed weren't just about feeding soldiers, they were about creating stability and uninterrupted production. It was the true difference between a system built on desperation and one built on confidence. On his last day, Sergeant Dale stopped Klaus near the main gate. The American didn't offer food, he offered something much more practical. Dale reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy packet, wrapped tightly in oilskin paper. Inside, Klaus found a variety of American vegetable seeds. "Take this home, son," Dale said, his expression serious. "Germany needs to grow more than just factories now. You know how the supply chain works. You know how to do it efficiently." The gift was a quiet act of faith. Dale, who had witnessed Klaus's breakdown, now entrusted him with the tools of creation. It was a transfer of knowledge, a sign that the Americans were sending back ambassadors of a new way of thinking. Klaus clasped the seeds tightly. The next morning, Klaus boarded the truck. As it rattled down the dusty road, he took his last look back at the vast Texas fields. He realized that the greatest lessons he had learned were not about serious difficulty, but about the immense moral and physical power of plenty. He carried with him the seed of an idea. The key to rebuilding lay not in hoarding scarcity, but in mastering abundance. The truck sped up. Klaus closed his eyes, the image of the bountiful Texas earth seared into his mind, knowing that the greatest battle he faced was still ahead, convincing a nation scarred by deprivation to believe in the possibility of surplus. The journey home was long and grim, a voyage back into the cold, gray reality of defeat and deprivation. When Klaus Richter finally stepped off the troop carrier in Bremerhaven, the air was frigid, the docks were rubble. He had returned to a homeland that seemed to confirm every fear he had held about scarcity. His village outside Hamburg was largely intact, but the economy was ruined. His family was alive, but gaunt. The hunger he had forgotten in Texas returned, yet the devastation was offset by the simple, powerful object he carried, the packet of American vegetable seeds. It was the promise of spring. Klaus did not initially set out to become a reformer. He simply sought to feed his family. But as he planted the exotic American seeds, he found himself applying the lessons learned from Sergeant Dale's warehouse. He didn't just plant vegetables, he planted a system. He organized his small garden plot with the same meticulous efficiency he had observed, focusing on maximum yield and minimum waste. He created a small compost system to recycle every scrap, understanding that even the swill barrel, when properly managed, was a source of future abundance. Soon, his small plot began to yield far more than his neighbors. The local farmers, skeptical at first, noticed the difference. Klaus, using his rough, camp-learned English, began to explain. He spoke not of philosophy but of logistics, crop rotation, and most critically, the American concept of proactive surplus, planting more than you needed to ensure you always had enough. His reputation grew, and within 2 years, Klaus was organizing the local agricultural collective. He implemented a centralized storage system accounting for spoilage. He was constantly urging them to think bigger, to move beyond the mindset of scarcity. He explained that their nation's vulnerability lay not just in its lack of resources, but in its inability to organize the resources they did possess with the cold, pragmatic confidence of the Americans. Decades later, in the 1970s, Klaus Richter had become a respected regional agricultural advisor. Speaking to young farmers, he was asked about the biggest lesson he learned in captivity. He pulled out the framed packet of seeds he always kept on his desk. "I grieved in Texas," he told them, his voice old and steady. "I grieved, not just for the food being thrown away, but for the realization that my nation had been beaten by abundance, not just bullets. We fought a war of scarcity, and they fought a war of systemic plenty. My tears were for the life we could have had if we had only understood that true power is found in the confidence to waste what you can immediately replace." Klaus never forgot the smell of the wasted peaches. It became a compass, guiding him toward a life built on efficiency, preparation, and the moral certainty of self-sufficiency. The tears he had shed in the Texas dust were the last tears he ever shed for the war. They were, in the end, the seeds from which he built his new life. This story is a powerful reminder that the greatest conflicts are often won not with weapons, but with ideas. If Klaus's journey from scarcity to surplus changed your perspective on history, like this video and subscribe for more untold stories that challenge everything you thought you knew.